So I'd like to tell you a little bit about myself first of all. I am Michelle Sollicito and I am an e-business consultant in the Atlanta area. Now you may notice that I have a bit of an accent. So I have lived in England most of my life, and I lived in New Zealand for a couple of years as well, and I've lived in Atlanta for the last 12 years. I've been an e-business consultant or an IT consultant in all three countries, and I've got experience from a number of organisations, very high quality organisations generally. I started off working for Anderson Consulting, who are now called Accenture, in 1990 after I graduated. I graduated from City University in London in business computing systems, and business computing systems is a degree that really it teaches you how to be an e-business consultant, and the whole point of the degree is learning how to do business functions using computers. So you start off with, you do some programming, you do database stuff, you do systems analysis and design, you do requirements, you do information about helping people to decide what their requirements are through interviews, you write reports. It's a very business focused computing course, so it's not like computer science. It's much more aimed at the computer consultant. For example, I did entity relationship diagrams and data modeling and data design. I did all kinds of work on technical architectures, how to design technical architectures and so on, and looked at things like business functions that might be done by computer software. So for example, accounting, HR, we looked at packages that might fulfill those requirements in a business and so on. So it's very different to the average computer science course. It was also carried out at CUBS, which is City University Business School, which is probably one of the best business schools in England, if not the best. It's a bit like Harvard is here in America. So it's known for its business, and it's situated right in the heart of London in the Barbican area. So when you leave the university, immediately you have on your doorstep all those big consultancy companies, all those IT companies and so on, right on your doorstep. So the first company I worked for was Anderson Consulting, who are now Accenture, and I worked with them for a few years. I worked at Northwest Water, who then later became United Utilities, and I did a lot of programming in C, Unix, Xmotif. Xmotif is a bit like Visual Basic, but for the Unix environment. I did some Oracle, some DB2. DB2 is an old-fashioned database on IBM mainframes, by the way. In those days, there was a lot of that about. And I was working on the biggest client-server project in Europe at the time, the Northwest Water project, and we had a lot of Anderson Consultancy people on the project. We also had some SEMA people on the project, some Logica people on the project, and a lot of Price Waterhouse people on the project, and a few other consultancy people thrown in here and there. So the next job I had after Accenture was actually Capgemini, which is another consultancy, another IT software consultancy. And Capgemini, I worked on, it was basically a fire department's command and control system, but it was designed to work for many fire departments, so it was meant to be configurable to different fire departments' needs. And the part that I worked on was the technical architecture part of that, which ensured that there was failover. So it ensured that if one of the servers went down, the other server came up and became kind of the master. It was in a master-slave type environment. And it really was very early on form of the clustering you see now in SQL Server. I implemented it at the time using C and Unix and RPC calls and so on, and we had like a heartbeat going between the two servers to find out which one was up and which one was down, kind of thing. And if one server didn't get a heartbeat back from the other, then it assumed that it was the master. So that was the technical architecture, the first technical architecture I really designed, and that ended up selling to a number of fire departments in England. And a command and control system, in case you do not know, is a system which the people behind, in England it's 999, but here it will be 911. The people behind those calls use a command and control system to decide which fire departments and which fire engines, which fire units are going out to the particular fire. I'm sure you've heard of, 2-alarm fire, 3-alarm fire, and so on. So in this country, depending on how severe the fire is, it's a different alarm level, and you would send out different numbers of units and different types of units according to the severity of the fire and so on. And really that command and control system that we built there was designed to do that. But different fire departments in England have different criteria for some of those things, and they have different requirements for managing all that kind of stuff. So that's what we built at Capgemini. So that was the main project that I worked on at Capgemini. I also worked when I was working at Capgemini for another client called 121 at the time, and they were a brand new cell phone company. The cell phones were just coming out when I worked there, and we built a system which basically took IMSI numbers, which are basically identifiers for cell phones, and linked those into all the other systems within the cell phone network that we were dealing with. So, for example, a particular cell phone would be linked to a particular order, and a particular order would be linked to a particular salesperson in a particular shop, so that salesperson got commission and on every time the cell phone was billed. And of course, again, the cell phone was also linked to the bills, and made sure that when payments didn't come in, that cell phone was then disconnected and so on. And also linked into all kinds of other systems for all kinds of purposes, like technical support, linked into the various billing management software areas, linked into the technical side, so that the call data records, which indicated when a phone call had been made between one cell phone and another cell phone, and whether that cell phone had been reached by this tower or that tower, and so on. All that kind of information. So we had to build a technical architecture that supported all those different uses of the IMSI number, the identification number for the cell phone. So that was a very interesting project, and that again I did at Capgemini. So that was very interesting because this was the first time that people in the UK had ever got their hands on a cell phone. And so no one really knew how they were going to respond when they started using cell phones, because obviously cell phones are very different to home phones, landlines, and we knew that they were going to come up with very big problems, but we didn't know what they were going to be like. And most of them were very confused that they couldn't access the network if they were inside a tunnel or if they were inside a building that had certain types of configuration. Cell phones are very different to landlines. You can't always get through, and the connectivity is not great. And at that time, of course, connectivity was really poor because it was brand new. It was basically the M25 is a ring road that goes around London. It's a little bit like the I-285 in Atlanta. And the ring road M25, anything within that ring road was covered by 121 at the time, but outside of that area, really, most people could not get coverage in most areas. So it was a very interesting time, and the first couple of days that the cell phones were actually available, even people like me who are really computer geeks were drafted in to man the phones, because we had so many help requests coming in, so many phone calls coming in, and we all had to man the phones and answer as many questions as we could before passing them on to anybody else if we couldn't. So that was a very interesting time. So just to give you an idea of some of the other projects I've worked on, I worked at SEMA, which is now Schlumberger, owned by Schlumberger, or actually part of it was Atos, A-T-O-S. But at SEMA, the main project I worked on there was the Railtrack project, which Railtrack was basically the privatization of part of the railway systems in the UK at the time. Nowadays, Railtrack is kind of a private entity, but at the time it was kind of a government-owned entity that dealt with all the private companies that ran the actual trains. So we were working on the main technical architecture part of the Railtrack programming. So we had to develop systems that managed the trains. And one of the interesting things I remember about that project was all the data guys, including me, sitting in a room and trying to define what a train was, because we had so many different definitions of what a train is, and we were trying to work out how we would know if we had more than one train or if we had two different types of train. And if you think about it, a train is in some contexts it's a journey from A to B. In some contexts it's a set of units that make up a train, but in those cases there are times when one unit is taken away from a train mid-journey or replaced by another unit, or made up into more units, or joined with another train, and so on. And sometimes a train is defined just by the engine that's driving the train, and there are so many different definitions of what a train was. So that's where I learned a lot about data definition and how to, and schemas and definitions of what a data element is. That's also when I first learned about object-oriented programming properly, which obviously we had to know what a train was before we could decide what the events were that happened to a train and which properties the train had and how they got updated and so on. So I was trying to learn about object-oriented programming at the same time as trying to define what a train was. So that was quite interesting because the definition of a train kept changing. So that was a very interesting project. Also at SEMA, I did another interesting project, which was an internal project to SEMA at the time, which later, or sort of at the same time, became a bigger thing, which was called DSDM RAD Apollo. So DSDM RAD was Dynamic Systems Design Method, and it became really the definition of what rapid application development was at that time. So we spent a lot of time looking at various projects and working out what was common about them and what could be done to speed them up and make rapid application development a possibility without losing the quality of the project and without all the risks associated with speeding up a project. So it was very interesting. We looked at what had to be done up front in a project in order for the project to be of good quality. For example, the technical architecture has to be defined up front. Some of the standards, the coding standards and so on, have to be defined up front. And some of the common functionality has to be designed up front so that the other programmers later on who build specific windows in those days or web pages nowadays and so on could reuse code that was common for common functions. So for example, accessing the database was a common function. In those days it used ODBC as the common mechanism to access the database, but we tried to make it even more common by putting some parameters into a function if you wanted to do a select function, or if you wanted to do an update or a delete and so on. So we created, a whole set of core functions that you would need on most projects in Visual Basic and at the time SQL Server, and also Sybase System 10 and 11 at the time too. So it was interesting because we were developing really a new methodology, DSDM RAD, which later on was basically taken on by many companies, especially in Europe, and later on became RUP as well. RUP evolved from DSDM RAD, And we also were developing common code that could be used for projects where, you know, DSDM and RAD was the methodology, especially Visual Basic and SQL Server projects and ODBC projects. So that was interesting too. I did a little bit of work for Admiral, which was a consultancy. I was in the Microsoft part of that consultancy, and I developed lots of coding standards and development standards for Microsoft projects. I also did some work with Admiral on a project which we basically took all the possibilities out there at the time for developing projects, and we tried to come up with common reusable objects that had useful functionality. So for example, we had the Oracle web server at the time and the Jeeves web server. Those were the two main platforms, with Oracle database behind the Oracle web server, and behind Jeeves we had not MySQL. We had Sybase System 10 or 11, I can't remember which. And we created, you know, common stored procedures in both, in PLSQL for the Oracle, and in Sybase System 10 or 11 we had, you know, Sybase stored procedures, which later on looked very much like SQL Server stored procedures. And we came up with those common routines that could be used in either one of those projects. We also looked at the whole technical architecture, so how a particular Java piece of code might call JDBC in those days was very similar to ODBC. JDBC was basically the bridge to the database. So how that code would call the stored procedures at the back end and so on, and came up with commonality there. And it was a very interesting project because at the time, you know, there was a lot of flux in the market. As you can imagine, there were really two main browsers at the time, Internet Explorer and Netscape, and they were competing. There were a number of web servers coming to the fore, although, you know, Oracle web server and the Jeeves Java web server was kind of the main two web servers. Although we did look at the time at PWS, which was a bit like IIS now for Microsoft, Personal Web Server it was called then. And we looked at a few other options too. And then we also had to look at, you know, the network, the security, and all kinds of issues, object-oriented design and development, and so on. So that was another really interesting project. So you can see that you know, a lot of my projects have given me a lot of insights into a lot of areas of e-business consultancy generally, all through. I also worked for Sainsbury's in their e-business department, which was just starting up when I was working there. And what we did was we looked at Sainsbury's as an entity and looked at all of the stakeholders, so the employees, the customers, the suppliers, the business partners, the warehouses that were part of Sainsbury's kind of, that they were sometimes owned by someone else, distribution channels and so on. We looked at all of that. And we looked at the data warehouse at Sainsbury's and what data there was in that warehouse that would be useful to all of those people, all of those stakeholders. And we looked at how we could share that information and really make Sainsbury's make as much data as possible available to all those stakeholders without compromising e-business, without compromising Sainsbury's business. So, as part of that, we looked at collaboration of many processes between Sainsbury's and its suppliers and its business partners and its subdivisions and so on. We looked at collaboration within Sainsbury's between different stores and head office on various projects and so on. Now, the collaboration was all about using central data to push it through a pipeline, really, of business processes, and to add value at each of those points on the pipeline. So, for example, there might be a safety project where we were looking at safer ways to bring goods to market. and that might involve, for example, bottling, it might involve distribution, logistics, it might involve people at the stores, it might involve people within the central administration part of Sainsbury's as well. But they would all add value to the same project. So they would all have different insights and so on. And it's a little bit like something like Facebook nowadays, in a Facebook group, whereby everyone could chime in and give their opinion on something, but they could also update the data and the database. And you know, one person might be responsible for a final document or a final product or what have you. For example, we had a quality control project whereby suppliers were to make suggestions of ways we could improve the quality of a can of baked beans, for example. And they would suggest, you know, a little bit more tomatoes in the product, or you know, better packaging or what have you. And a project would be created for each of the possibilities, and anyone that had any input would go along with that project and would help push it through and help it happen and help monitor it to production, basically. And then there were other projects like product promotions, where a new product would be introduced to a particular store or a particular set of stores as a kind of a test market, and they would collaborate on how to, you know, monitor that product and how to improve that product, and whether they should do a promotion like a buy one get one free, and where they should have the product displayed within a store, you know, packaging information and all kinds of things like that. So that was a very interesting project. There was another side to that project too, which the e-business department wanted to make different information available to suppliers. For example, from the stores, Sainsbury's, that's the big supermarket I was working for, Sainsbury's had lots of stores and they had lots of products within each store, and every day there would be different sales numbers for each of those products. So they wanted the suppliers to be able to see the products that they were responsible for, but not any competing products, obviously. So they gave the suppliers a view in to the products that they were responsible for, to see what the previous day's sales figures were, and to monitor that over time, over, you know, a year, for example, or monitor it over a particular 3-month period or a few days, whatever they wanted to look at. To monitor it by store, so you could see where the product was selling at stores better than others. Perhaps it was selling better in London than it was up north, and so on. So that was a very interesting project as well, and I worked on that quite a lot. And that involved a data extract every night of the sales information down to the supplier database, and then the suppliers had access from there. And we used Lotus Domino, actually, Lotus Notes, to provide security access at the time, because at the time, you know, the web was still evolving and there wasn't a lot of security available on some of the other options. Lotus Domino at the time was probably the best security option for that. So that was another interesting project that I worked on. I've worked on so many projects, it's really quite hard to talk about just a few. TMS, the Mandelbrot set, are a famous Microsoft consultancy in England, and I worked for them for a while. And part of my work there was to project manage the production of 2 books about Visual Basic. So one was Advanced Visual Basic 5 and one was Advanced Visual Basic 6. And we had a whole team of people who were complete experts in Visual Basic. At the time, you know, TMS, the Mandelbrot set, was very well known to be the software house in England if you wanted Microsoft expertise, if you wanted quality Microsoft expertise. So we developed the book with Microsoft Press. Microsoft Press were the sort of publishers, and I liaised with those on a daily basis about what they wanted and how they wanted it formatted and so on. And then I would talk to all the guys who were the experts in Visual Basic and translate that into techie language so that they produced the right information, what Microsoft saw their clients, their customers needing to know about Visual Basic. And those two books sold very many copies, and it was a very successful couple of books. And it had a great video on the back as well. If anyone's got a copy, the CD is very funny. And it also has lots of sample code on the CD as well to support the book. So that was a very interesting project too. Where else have I worked? So I worked at Bovis Lend-Lease as well. I managed a huge group of people in a number of different projects. Some of them were working on Lotus Domino projects, and some of them were working on Visual Basic projects with SQL Server behind it. And I did so much work on that piece of work. It's hard to really single in on one thing, but one of the interesting things we did was we used a code generator on that project, and that was a real eye-opener. It taught me a lot about code generators. I'd already used a code generator before for a small piece of work I'd done for a software house, and it was very interesting to see how code generators work and how they're useful for some things on projects and there's limitations for other things on projects. And it taught me a lot, and one of the things that I really learned was you have to get a really good database design first before you start generating code with most of these code generators. And the reason behind that is very solid, because really the database should be fairly static, not completely static, but fairly static. The relationships should represent real world relationships, and because of that, the structure of the database, the relationships in the database, the type of data in the database, it needs to be data that doesn't have duplication and has no redundancy, data that's reliable, and so on. And once you've got good data and good database, then you can start generating code from that. But don't try it if you haven't. And the reason that is relevant is because nowadays some of the work I do involves using the entity framework in Visual Studio, Visual C#. And the entity framework, you've got two options. You've got database first or code first. And I've worked on a number of projects, and the database first option is definitely the way to go. I have learnt that the hard way. I worked on a project where they did code first generation, and it really doesn't work very well. And there are very good reasons for that, and I will go into all that in another session. Okay, so what else have I done that you need to know about? So I've worked at Yahoo. That was a very interesting project. So I was the international project manager of a big portal project for Merck. So Merck were the client, and Yahoo was building the portal for them. Now Merck, I don't know if you know much about Merck, but they are mainly, they're an international company, sorry, not product, an international company, and they have a lot of people in the US, the United States, but they have a lot of people in Europe, and they have a lot of people in other parts of the world too. So that project involved a lot of what we call internationalization. Now, internationalization is all about making sure that the words on the page are translated into a language that the user understands. Yes, that's true, but also there are a lot of complications involved in that, and I will do a whole section on internationalization, but that was the key issue on that project. For example, Hebrew, the characters and whether a language is left to right or right to left, characters like Chinese and so on. There were so many issues around internationalization, and also just cultural issues. For example, you can't just simply translate word for word what a label says. The label might be completely different wording in another language, for example. And that's why later on I loved Microsoft solutions to internationalization, and I can talk about that in another section, but you know, that they are a wonderful way of getting around all the issues in internationalization, believe me. So that was Yahoo. What else have I done? So more recently, I've worked for lots of clients. I've been self-employed as a consultant, and I've just done lots of really interesting projects. My key criteria when I take on a project is that it's interesting and I'll learn something very new. I love to keep up with new technologies. So one of my best clients in the last few years has been Apogee Interactive, and I've worked for them twice, once about 10 years ago and once about 2 years ago. And the most recent time I worked for them for nearly 2 years, about 18 months, 2 years. And when I worked for them, we were doing a full range of Visual C# projects, SQL Server at the back end, C# at the front end. And Apogee are a consultancy to the utilities industry, so they work for people like Southern Company, Georgia Power, people like Flint Electric, and so many other utility companies. And so what I was doing was writing the code on the websites that allowed people, the customers of these utility companies, like the electricity companies, to work out how to reduce their bills online. So we created utility calculators, and what they did was they worked out what your gas, electricity, and so on, and water costs were, depending on different things you did in your house. So first of all, you would put in all the criteria for your house. So you'd say, you know, how many bedrooms it has, how many bathrooms it has, whether you've got a washing machine, whether you've got a fridge, whether that fridge is a good fridge in terms of the environment or a bad fridge, and the washing machine too, you know, whether it's environmentally friendly or not, and so on. And you would put all those criteria into the calculator, and it would work out the best way for you to save money on electricity. And that would involve things like just turning the thermostat down, for example, or it would involve things like just unplugging some of your devices in your house. It might involve getting a new fridge because that fridge is so old that it's using up lots of electricity. It might involve doing some changes to your windows so that they were more insulating as windows can be, and insulating the roof as well might be another one. And the calculators were very, very clever. It's incredible how much you know from somebody's electricity bill or utilities bill, or even just from a description of their house, you know, where they live, whether it's south facing, north facing, whether they use one type of heating or another type of heating, and so on. So we developed calculators for that. Now, those calculators moved through many generations on the web. So we went from ASP Classic right through to C#, .NET, you know, various versions, right up to 4.5 while I was there, and I think 5 just after I left. You know, it went to MVC, if anybody knows what MVC is. MVC is a technical architecture whereby you have a model, a view, and a controller. And the view is basically what you see on the web page, the pretty front end, if you like, that you see on a web page. The controller is really, it's like a processor that takes in the information from the screen that the user has input and then asks for the right data from the model. So the model is where the data is stored. So the controller is kind of the bit in between the two, if you like. So we went to MVC, and then we went to things like MVVM later on, which was, MVVM is basically, normally employs JavaScript, normally employs Ajax. We used things like Bootstrap, we used Angular, Node, Knockout, Ext.js, and so on. We use lots of different options, but basically what MVVM does is it basically updates automatically the front end, the view part of the thing, because it links so closely between the view and the model. That's really, in a nutshell, what that means. And I will do that in more detail later on. But just so you know, I got a lot of experience in that too. And you know, this area was particularly useful for mobile devices, which of course, as I went on, we were doing more and more smartphone apps, if you like. But when I say smartphone, I should say smart device, because a lot of them worked on tablets and so on. And they had to be almost device independent. So Bootstrap especially was very good as a tool for that, and we will talk about Bootstrap in another section. So that brings you up to about 2 years ago. In the last year, I've really become a big Facebook expert, and I can talk about that in another section, why I became a Facebook expert and how that has perpetuated in my life. So a lot of the work I've done more recently has been using Facebook, and I've done a lot of C# calls to Facebook using their API. Facebook has an API, and it's an OAuth API for anyone that knows what that is, and we can talk about that later too. So that's a big part of what I've done in the last year. I also wrote a white paper on Facebook API, C# to Facebook API, and I've done an awful lot of work as well in business continuity planning and disaster recovery, but for Georgia State, the state of Georgia, for the emergency management agencies, for GEMA, for FEMA, and so on. And that has also come out of the same thing that I'm famous for Facebook for. Now, that whole thing is all to do with a Facebook group that I started called Snowed Out Atlanta, which saved a lot of people in the snowstorms in January 2014. So I became like a Facebook guru because of that, because everyone suddenly knew that I started that Snowed Out Atlanta Facebook group, which, by the way, was apparently the fastest growing Facebook group in history. And I ended up writing a book about that and so on. So that's why I've really got into Facebook and emergency management and disaster recovery and business continuity planning there. Now, just to recap on the business continuity planning and disaster recovery area, the reason I know enough about business continuity planning and disaster recovery now to help Georgia and the state of Georgia and EMAs and so on is because I've got so much experience in it from past work that I've done. Now, I've left a lot of that out until now so that I could talk about it now. So, for example, when I worked at Anderson Consulting, I did some ISO audits, which is ISO 9000 and X, so 9001 or what have you. They were kind of quality audits, so I did quite a lot of those, of the projects that I was working on with Anderson's at the time. And then when I worked at SEMA, I did some quality control work in that area. I did code reviews and I did database reviews and so on. And the work that I told you I was doing on DSDM and RAD was all about trying to put some of those principles and those policies, if you like, into the new methodology that we were creating at the time. So when I went to New Zealand in the year 2000, I did some Y2K work, year 2000 audit work, which I had actually started doing some Y2K work at Sainsbury's just before I left England for New Zealand. So I'd done some Y2K year 2000 work before I went to New Zealand, but then I did some more in New Zealand. So I became kind of an expert in Y2K year 2000 work there. So that was from like 1998 to 2000, I guess. So then after that, because I'd done that work when I was in New Zealand, I did some COBIT audits, which really COBIT is all about checking a particular company to make sure it has things like business continuity plans, disaster recovery plans, it has a secure location for the servers, it has security to make sure that people have passwords that are a particular length and type and so on, checking for all those kind of things. So that was that kind of an audit, a COBIT audit. ISO 9000 audits are more about making sure that the documentation is in place, to make sure that the procedures are in place, to make sure people are following them. Now, COBIT has that in it too, but it's much more about the whole IT infrastructure. And then later on in life, I did, since I've been in America, I did some work for Earthlink, where I did an audit, which was, at the time it was Sarbanes-Oxley audit, which is a law that came into effect after a few financial scandals in America. So Sarbanes-Oxley has similar content to COBIT, really, the same kinds of checks, but it also has a lot of financial controls checks, which are in addition to COBIT. So I worked on a Sarbanes-Oxley audit for Earthlink. So with Earthlink, I looked at all of their networks, all of their systems, all of their code. I reviewed their code, their databases, looked at all their procedures, all their policies in all the IT areas. I had to go down to their data center and actually go and visually see it and make sure that things were working properly, making sure that the security was all working correctly. I had to test out the disaster recovery plans and so on. So that was useful too. And as part of that, I ended up writing a book about business continuity planning and disaster recovery. And I also wrote a few articles as well about those areas. So because I've written a book in business continuity planning and disaster recovery, I'm kind of seen as a little bit of an expert in business continuity planning and disaster recovery, and also in audits. So that's how I got into this whole helping Georgia, the state, with its business continuity planning and disaster recovery, and also with its policies, especially regarding social media, because I'm known as the Facebook guru. They especially wanted my input on Facebook policies, social media policies, and so on. So hopefully that gives you an idea of who I am. I feel like I've told you so much. I'm trying to think what else I need to tell you. I want to tell you a bit about e-business and what e-business is and what e-business consultancy is and so on, but I'm going to do that in the next video, because this video really has gone on for far too long now. So I hope now you feel like you know me pretty well, and hopefully you can see my LinkedIn link and my resume and so on at the bottom of this section, and go on to the next section to find out all about what an e-business consultant is and what they do. Thank you.